professor of anthropology at Cal State Fullerton. He's also the Environmental Studies Program Coordinator, the founding director of the Center for Sustainability at Cal State Fullerton. And as Dr. Bock investigates the interface of biology and culture, he focuses on these 5 main research areas: parental investment and child development in a cross-cultural socio-ecological perspective, family and household demography, health, especially the relationship between access to resources and health outcomes among indigenous and minority peoples, the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. He studies indigenous and minority peoples in North America, Africa, and elsewhere to determine the effects of economic development, globalization, market incorporation, and integration into national level, political, economic, and social institutions. I was privileged to have him as an instructor at Cal State Fullerton, and he helped me close the gap between rhetoric and research, and his commitment to the integrity and power of research as activism still inspires me to this day. Dr. Bock.
Thanks so much, Chip. It's really a privilege to be here and to follow such wonderful talks by Mark Lee and by Michael and Jane, and to see so many people here who are committed to these issues and interested, and so many young people, and to see that here at Golden West, this is a set of themes and issues that has real meaning to people. I'm not as erudite or articulate as your previous speakers. I'm a little more rough-edged. And really what I'm going to say is a little more rough-edged, because I'm going to touch on some of the things that Michael and Jane were looking at, which are power issues, power relations between individuals, and tension. And I think these are so relevant to the theme of today, of peace, because as Mark Lee pointed out, these differentials in power, tension among individuals and between groups of individuals, exists in the world. The difference between violence and nonviolence, between war and peace, is not to pretend that these things don't exist, but it's how we handle them and how we deal with them. And I think to come to a place where we can deal with them in a fair way, an equitable way, a just way, means really exploring them and understanding where we each come from in terms of these issues and what are we going to do, what action can each one of us take to change things and to bring about justice in these areas. So the first thing is, so I have a lot of questions, but unfortunately I don't have any answers, right? The answers are all of you young people in this room, people my age, you know, things are the way they are because of people my age, right? So we need young people with new ideas and new energy to help come up with answers. So the first question I just want to throw out there is, who here is a strong supporter of human rights? Who's a strong supporter of sustainability? Keep that hand up. You raise your other hand. Who's a strong supporter of sustainability? All right. Who thinks that you can have both of these things in the world? Who thinks that to close that gap and overcome that tension is going to take an enormous amount of effort? I do, right? So that's one of the things I want to explore today. Because as Chip mentioned, I'm very committed to sustainability, but we have to ask ourselves, and this touches on some things that Michael and Jane talked about, isn't the sustainability stuff just the new colonialism? Isn't this a way that we can maintain our lifestyle in the West and institutionalize power relations between wealthy nations and poor nations, between the developed world and the developing world, and maintain that power structure under the guise of doing something good for the globe? Where is the line between benefiting all of humanity and benefiting ourselves? So think about that. So one of the issues, and I was glad to hear Michael bring it up, is population. Because there are a lot of people in the world, right? You know, I'm an anthropologist, so I spent some time studying our evolutionary history and our relationship with the other primates. And humans are really a successful animal in the sense of reproduction, right? We're very different from the other apes in that we have multiple dependents, we have short birth spacing, we have care by other people besides the mother, so there's alloparenting. And this is the reason why, one of the big reasons why, there's 6 billion of us, and as Jane pointed out, our great ape relatives may very well go extinct in your lifetime, right? Because humans are very, very good at extracting resources from the environment and converting them into reproduction. And our ancestors were very good at this. When the humans diverged from the other apes, this is something that we gained a big advantage in. And now we have a lot of issues because of this. So Joel Cohen asked a few years ago the question, how many people can the Earth support? And he realized, of course, that, and this is a quote from him on your right, that the question is incomplete. What kind of life? A life like this that we're living here in Orange County? Not as many as we've got. All 6 billion people in the world can't live like this with our current technology and the way that we're using resources and the rate at which we're consuming things. And this, of course, causes a lot of problems, which is why I'm sure some of you have spent time defending our national interests in Iraq and Afghanistan, and why we're involved in Libya and things like this. And not only that, why there was debate. Should we support people trying to institute democratic change in their countries? Is that in our national interests? Or would we rather deal with dictators who are going to assure a supply of oil, right? So these issues are fundamental to what happens in the world. So we see here 3 projections, right? We're in the blue line somewhere there, where population growth is increasing pretty rapidly. So maybe it's going to keep increasing like that for a long time, and then there'd be a real lot of people in the world. Maybe it's going to turn over in a few years, the population starts to decrease. But that in itself is not, I think, the most important question. Because the number of people in the world is a misleading figure. Really, we're talking about populations of people in the plural. There are all kinds of human populations. There are people living very different lifestyles. From an ecological perspective, they're in different environments and different ecologies. Their use of resources is very different. How they acquire resources from the environment is very different. How they convert those resources into other kinds of activities is very different. And so we can't just look at population, we have to look at the total picture, including consumption. And we can call this ecological footprint, environmental pressure. In some ways, for those of you who've been in ecology classes, it's related to the idea of carrying capacity. And this is really about the total amount of resources used, or the idea that it's the population times the consumption, or the per capita consumption. So on the right, there's a map of global ecological footprint. And so you can see Africa, right there, looks very tiny, although there's 1 billion people in Africa, 6 of the world's population. But it's a little tiny place in this big map in the United States, which has, maybe I need to ask a math major what percent, what's it, is it 5% of the world's population, I think. It's huge, right? It's it's almost as big as all of Asia. It's many times bigger than Africa. Why? Well, when we look at ecological footprint, when we look at the amount of resources that are consumed and used, we 5% of the population, but consume a quarter of the world's resources, right? So per capita consumption varies really widely. So when we talk about population being a problem, it's the problem of population these people over here, who, might I point out, we have a lot of power over, is that these people right here, who we also have some power over, because of course our military spending is equal to the military spending of every other country on Earth combined, are the problem these people over here, or is the population problem the people over here? because your ecological footprint, as just on average, because you could say, oh, you know, you compost, you do this, you do that, etc. But, you know, if we're going to talk about groups of people, well, then you get to pay the cost of being a member of our group in the United States. And your ecological footprint is about, and no, that isn't my foot going through the earth, people who are saying. It's about 13 times that of the average African. Right? So there's a huge difference here. So we talk about population problem. If we view it as a global problem, well, you're equal to 13 Africans. So an African person can have 26 children and they have the same impact on global resources that the average American with 2 children does. So when we talk about fertility and population, we're not talking, it's not the same thing as the cost in terms of ecological footprint. Now, family planning programs. What are they really? Well, on the one hand, you know, when they were developed in the 60s, people looked and saw this issue. The world population seemed to be increasing. We know that the number of people in the world has a big impact on global resources. And people looked and said, well, you know, fertility is lower in industrialized and developed countries. Many developing countries are undergoing what was called the demographic transition, or today we might say fertility transition, from high fertility to low fertility, coupled with low mortality and longevity. And so really we need to focus on those people in these developing countries and get them to limit their fertility. Of course, but having someone in Africa, and this isn't, and right now I'm not addressing some of the other issues around family planning, such as power between men and women, which is a huge issue, or women's education. I'll tell you, I'll take a second and go on a tangent, which is I spent many, many years working in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in Botswana, which is a landlocked country. Everybody says a landlocked country the size of Texas in South Central Africa. And I lived in very small, remote villages and where we were completely isolated from national infrastructure. And one day, when talking, at that time I didn't have any kids, talking to local women in the community, her friends, my wife mentioned that, you know, we didn't have kids yet, and people were, you know, very, very cute. You know, now the door had been opened up to this. And, you know, why don't you have kids? She said, well, you know, we have medicine that can stop a woman from having kids. And so women were all of a sudden saying, give me some medicine. Where do I get it? But more importantly, why can't I have it? Why do you get it? What is it about my life that I can't have that medicine too? Right? So these issues are very broad. And if we look at this, though, from the question of population, we can put a lot of effort into getting people in Africa or South America or Asia to limit their fertility. And especially the African example, because it's sort of the most extreme. A person having one less child in Africa is the same as 13 people in our society having one less child. So where should we devote those resources in terms of family planning exercises? Is this because it's much easier when we have influence over people with less power, with less resources? We can get them to do it so we don't have to. So that's one of the questions I'm going to put to you. The next thing I wanted to bring up, sort of the next set of ideas that relate to power and tension, is the ideas behind the protection of natural resources. Now, a lot of you are, who's familiar with Tragedy of the Commons? A few people. And really, when we talk about it's really the tragedy of the unmanaged commons is one way to, probably an important way to think about it. But in a sort of general sense, this is the idea that when there are communally held resources, that those are everybody owns, then because no one's responsible, people can overuse them and deplete them. And here is, for instance, overgrazed territory, right? So if the pastures are communally owned, everyone puts their cattle in the pasture, they're depleted. Well, why would an individual take their cow out, or their cows, if their neighbor is going to continue to use the resources and deplete it, right? So this was recognized by Garrett Hardin about 40 years ago. And we can say that it makes altruism a very difficult way to manage natural resources, because it's asking some people to sacrifice when others do not, and so the benefits accrue to those who do not sacrifice, and the cost accrues to those who do sacrifice. And it's not a very sustainable kind of system, because the resource gets depleted. And of course, a great example of this right now is our fisheries, where, you've heard, we've taken 90% of the fish out of the ocean. Right? So there's fisheries collapsing all over the world. And who owns the fish? Well, for a long time people would say something was too big to count. They'd say because it's as many as all the fish in the sea. But gee, now we can count all the fish in the sea and there aren't all that many of them. Right? And this is because anybody with a fishing boat can essentially, in the open ocean, fish as much as they want. And who is there to stop them? So we see lots of resources like this. Water. You know, when I was living in a small village in Botswana, we would get our water from the Okavango River, which is a river that rises in the rainforest of Angola. But we're in the Kalahari deserts. It's a really dry place, but there's a river going right through the middle. And so every day, everybody in the village, including me, would get their bucket or their pot or whatever they had to use to carry water and make the trek down to the river, which was, you know, not that far, maybe half a mile downhill. And unfortunately, someone made the mistake and put the river downhill. And I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so downhill to the river, fill up their bucket or their pail, whatever, and carry it back up to where we lived. I spent several years doing this all the time. And so you learn to appreciate use of water. So a bucket, you might have 2, 3, 4 gallons of water in it, which when you're collecting it that way and it's 120 degrees out, you really care about that water because you have ownership of that water. You've gone and gotten that water. And of course, what do we do with that much water? Well, every time you go to the bathroom, right? And so communal resources like that, and water here, of course, is not costly in terms of time or energy. It's extremely cheap. And so we import a great amount of water. We use a lot of energy to bring water here. We now recycle our toilet water. So we're doing a little more conservation, and Orange County is a leader in that. But still, there's very little incentive to increase the amount of water use. And this, of course, is also not sustainable. And here in places like Orange County, in 20 years, having sort of free, clean, abundant water is not going to be, it's not going to be free or very cheap. And so the cleaner the water you're going to want, the more you're going to have to pay for it. So this is, you know, one of the issues we face. So as I mentioned, there are a couple different approaches people have had to tragedy of the commons. One is appeal to altruism, sort of hortatory ideas that people should sacrifice. It works sometimes. Privatization is another way that's been very popular. In some places, for instance, governments have privatized the water system, right, for this purpose. Of course, there are very high prices associated with this and high costs associated. But this is the way in our society that we have chosen to protect most natural areas that people are interested in preserving, the American National Park model. So this is actually a real model, right? This is a national park on a table, but it's sort of the same idea, that to build a barrier, and that's an isolated place that is protected. And this is really an outgrowth of our history. Of course, there were people here before Europeans came, right? The people who were here had what's called a land tenure system, which means they had a system of using the land and knowing who used it for what. In fact, they had many different systems. But their systems were generally very different from that of the Europeans, who came from a place where land was very finite, which is one reason they were here, and where the idea of ownership and control of the land was very deeply ingrained in European culture and the political system. And so, when we know many, many stories of this and the whole sad, very sad history of treaties and agreements with Native American nations and what happened, but underlying that was the idea that land should be owned by an entity, and there should be a piece of paper saying, this entity, an individual organization, a state, a government owns this land. And that was because in Europe, crown land was protected for the royalty to hunt, to keep the riffraff out so they wouldn't deplete it. And this was the model that when people started seeing the massive depletion of Western fauna and flora, fauna especially, that this model was applied. Now, in the 1960s especially, this was exported from America. And the first places it was exported to was Africa by people who were well-meaning, and they were trying to sell. They saw resources in Africa being depleted in a number of ways, and saw the American model as being an effective way to preserve land. Of course, just like here, in Africa, people lived with wildlife resources for millennia. Right? The people that I worked with in Botswana have lived in that spot for their ancestors for 50,000 years, 75,000 years. You know what? They hadn't depleted the resources till after colonialism, and until after people were paying for hides and other things, and the value of animals changed. So this American model was applied throughout Africa. You know, here, this is a picture of a house, someone's house in Botswana. And people like this, living like this, were moved off their land throughout Africa, and not allowed to use the resources that they used for generations, for food, for building, for other things. And often settled into undesirable land where it's very difficult to get resources out of the environment, which is why they could be there. Sound familiar? It's not dissimilar to what happened in Australia, what happened in North America. And people in these situations are subject to a lot of what is euphemistically called diseases of civilization, right? Terrible diets, exposure to alcohol and drugs, other illnesses, idleness because there's no work, dysfunction in the family as a result, their cultural knowledge and identity disrupted and lost. You know, it's a very, very sad situation, right? Very, very desperate sort of situation. And one response to this was the idea that, and Michael and Jane talked a little bit about this in the context of ecotourism, that community-based programs of natural resource management, if people could manage their own resources, have some stake in it, work cooperatively, that they would accrue the benefits, and that the resources could be managed in a way that people could use them, but not deplete them. And people developed more sophisticated management plans with multiple areas of use, like buffer zones around parks, etc. Some of these have worked pretty well, others have not. In Botswana, I was very deeply involved in developing these plans, And they've had mixed results. These are a lot of things, very, very fragile experiments. And there's a lot of things that need to come into line for them to work. Michael brought up the issue of who's in control, where is the benefit actually going, right? So we say a community. Well, you know, what's a community actually mean? A community is a number of individuals. And so if we say, oh, this is great, all the resources are going to the community, but in reality they're going to a couple of individuals within the community, that system isn't going to be very sustainable, right? So these are very, very difficult things to accomplish well. So, back to a case study that I'm going to just bring up. From Botswana, as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time there. The landlocked country in South Central Africa. It's a world leader in conservation, recognized all over the world. The president has been very, very dedicated to conservation, the patron of the Kalahari Conservation Society. He has been very active in preserving resources. Botswana is a great example in Africa of a democratic government. It's like a 1.1 party state, just a little bit past a one-party state. There hasn't yet been a peaceful transition of power between parties, but within the party there's continual peaceful transition. Leader in community-based natural resource programs, etc. Always called an African success story, right? And it is in many, many, many ways. So one of the crown jewels of Botswana's conservation programs is Central Kalahari Game Reserve, which was established even before Botswana was a country. So Botswana became independent in 1966. So in 1961, 6% of the area, what was then Bechuanaland, now called Botswana, was set aside for the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, smack dab in the center of the country. 25 times the size of Orange County, twice the size of Massachusetts, 50,000 square kilometers. Now there have been people living there for many thousands of years, maybe even 100,000 years. I call them Bushmen, which is because most of the Bushman people I know call themselves Bushmen when they're speaking English, but people refer to them as San-speaking people. The groups living in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, the Po, are one of the main groups. Until the 1980s, really across Botswana, when I first started working in Botswana, these remote areas, the government wasn't very much involved. They were really, they didn't have an army, they had very little governmental presence. But around that time, they discovered diamonds. And Botswana is now one of the world's largest diamond producers. And the government's been pretty responsible for using diamonds, and they've used them to build schools, to build infrastructure. It's not like a lot of other places in the developing world where the politicians have lined their pockets to obscene levels and no one else's share. They've been very good about it. But after that point, the government started to extend into these rural areas. Well, one area was they brought in a lot of consultants from the United States and other places to deal with their national parks. And the consultants were of the opinion that national parks should not have people in the middle. Of course, you know, the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, for people who've seen Cry of the Kalahari or read it, Mark and Billy Owens were there at Deception Pan. It's one of the world's great wildlife areas. And so the people there who had been allowed to stay there since the park was established, as long as they were using traditional technology to harvest resources, which is a euphemism for killing animals with poison darts, right? And chasing them until they're exhausted and hacking them up, which is how people lived, had to leave. Now they fought it for a long time, right? For about 15 years, but finally the relocations began. And there were 3 relocations, and by the end of the 3rd relocation, of course, fortunately we had Peace Corps volunteers that are helping with the relocations, right? Something to consider. Very few people, there were just a couple people able to hang on, but basically everyone was gone. They had lived in a place called Chade, and now they were moved to a place about 10 miles away called Chade, which was barren. right? Just a spot, nothing there. The government drilled a borehole, a well, because it's an extremely dry place. They had a well back at their old place, but they weren't allowed to go back to it. The well at the new place failed. They couldn't get water. People weren't able to hunt, which is how they supported themselves, or gather mangongo nuts or other nuts, or roots, which is what people did to eat. And people tried to go back into the reserve, and in a very shameful way, the government of Botswana, the police, the army, the game scouts beat people, tortured them, hooked up electrodes through their genital areas and things like this. Very, very awful kinds of things. Even there alleged some killings, but clearly the torture and things like that went on for quite a while. So, as I mentioned, being in the settlement was not so great because people were dependent on government handouts, the land's undesirable, they didn't have any access to water or firewood, and of course they faced, as I mentioned, these diseases of civilization. Now there was a group, Kalahari, which means First Peoples of the Kalahari, founded by a man named Roy Sisena, that sued the government. And when this started, no Bushman had ever been to the university, right? And only a few had graduated from high school. But Roy met people, he worked with Survival International and some other groups, and they sued, and they won. But even though they won the right to return, right, it was a tremendous victory. But even though they won the right to return, the government, the people in the government, the police, the game scouts, things like this, have steadfastly refused to implement the ruling, even though the government has agreed to do this. So again, they live in this terrible limbo. They can't go home. They're stuck there. The government has cordoned off the park, so they can't visit their homes. But what's there now at Chade, where they used to live? Well, they can't visit, but you can. Because Wilderness Safaris, which is listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, has a beautiful camp there called Kalahari Plains. So after you're off with your game drive or your game walk, you can take a dip in the pool. You know, it looks pretty nice. And you have a nice meal, have some drinks. You can sleep in your beautiful Meru tent with and suite facilities, right? And 10 miles away, the people whose land that is are living in cardboard boxes. And they don't have firewood, and they don't have water, and the kids can't go to school. Right? So this is a major issue. So when we're talking about things like ecotourism, about preserving natural resources, we have to be aware that there's tension involved. You know, I spent many, many years working with people like this, and I can tell you, and I don't mean this to be, this is not me being sort of flip about this, but while people have great respect for animals, and there's a big spiritual side to their understanding of nature among the Bushmen and their relationship to animals, they also never met an antelope that they didn't want to put a poison dart in, right? And so their idea of preserving nature and interacting with nature is really different from wilderness safaris and from the consultants the government of Botswana hired. So for about $1,000 a day, you can be there, and the wilderness safaris also offers a Bushman Walk. So because they've hired people from Chade to come work at the camp. So while they can't stay there, they can, some of the fortunate people can go, a couple of the staff members who are Bushmen will take you and show you where they used to live. So the government of Botswana says, well, they're preserving these resources for all the citizens of Botswana. Tourism being an important income, true. A very important ecosystem protected, true. Biodiversity preserved, true. The Bushmen are citizens like everyone else, true. So they will benefit as well? Not yet. Right? We'll see if it's true. And also, I should point out that the Central Kalahari Game Reserve has one of the world's largest deposits of unmined diamonds. So maybe there are some other reasons why it's good that the Bushmen aren't there from the government's perspective. So, who gets to say how many children anyone has? Is it you? Is it our government? Is it Planned Parenthood? Is it the UN? What people do with their land? How they use their resources? Is there a difference between this is the Lamalera whale hunters of Indonesia killing a sperm whale, right? Most of us would think this is a sperm whale, you know, this is really, really awful. Paul Watson is going to be at Cal State Fullerton tomorrow morning. Anybody who's interested, 9 a.m. he's talking. And, you know, people devote their lives, they look at this, they say, this is an intelligent being. It's not that different from me in a lot of ways as a person. And here it's died this horrible death, right? And, you know, look at how people are hunting these whales at Lamalera. But what else are the people in Lamalera supposed to do? Where are the Lamalera students here at Golden West College getting an education so they can change their life, right? How many of you are willing to give up your seat in a class? That would take many of you because it would cost to bring the people from Lamalera here to change their lives in a positive way. So the outsiders aren't just saying to them, change because we want you to change, because we care about whales. We don't care about your kids. We don't care about your life. We don't care about how you live or what you need to do to live. But this makes us feel bad, so we want you to stop. Don't we want them to be able to change their lives for the better from within? So is there a difference between this and that, right? This is Japanese industrial whaling. So, you know, we think this should stop. Should this stop? And why? So I'll leave it at that. As I said, I don't have any answers. I just have a whole lot of hard questions to ask. Thank you very much.